Let's begin. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Exchange podcast. Today, I'm continuing the conversation with Tom Loosemore, UK Government Digital Services co-founder. I'm your host, Ari Hirschberg, Director of Digital Community Engagement at the Digital Office. Today, Tom joins me from the UK. Tom has been at the center of some of the most significant projects of the internet era, including founding and scaling the UK Government Digital Services, leading the early development of gov.uk, and writing the BBC's first internet strategy. His focus is creating services that are so good and fast they seem magical. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation as Tom answers some of the top questions from the Digital BC livestream. We have some great questions for you. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much for inviting me on this podcast. I'm really looking forward to it.
Me too. So let's begin. Question one. What did you think it would be like working in UK government digital services before you started?
Oh, well, there's two answers to that question. One is, what did I think it would be like working for GDS? Well, I have the great privilege of being able to set up a new institution. You kind of get to decide what it's like when you work there. I had some very strong opinions about the kind of culture I wanted that was very human and very team-based, very empowering and empowered, and very delivery focused. And genuinely privileged to be able to establish a culture and a way of working that encapsulates those principles. And not to say there's some downsides. There was definitely some issues with people working too hard, some burnout risk in that culture, which I think we learned along the way that, not least myself, I definitely burnt out at one point. But I think, so, on one level, you get the privilege. If you found something, it's on you what it's like to work there. So if it's terrible, that's all on you. And it wasn't terrible. I really enjoyed working there. I think there's a slightly different way to answer that question, which is, what did I think it would be like to become a civil servant and to join the civil service, albeit with the privilege of setting up a new institution within the civil service? And truth be known, I knew lots of civil servants before I joined. I knew quite a lot about the culture. And to be honest, I'd worked for a long time at the BBC, whose culture echoes quite a lot of civil service culture in some ways, not completely by any means, but in some ways. And I think I certainly knew that some of those dynamics, the game playing that goes on in large federated institutions with public purpose, I learned those lessons very much the hard way at the BBC. And actually, one reflection about joining the civil service was it's actually relatively easier as a place to operate, as an environment to operate, than it was at the BBC. I mean, in the civil service, it wasn't a good look to lie to people, whereas in the BBC, people would lie to people all the time. I mean, people may dissemble in the civil service and sort of, gloss things over, but it was definitely wrong. It's deemed to be wrong to lie. It was in many ways the same as I expected, but I definitely was able to use what I'd learned at the BBC to good effect, I think.
So when you started then, so you already knew how to take care of the people under you. Like you knew all the rules from BBC, I guess, on how to take all the people under you and make sure that they can move forward fast, quickly in the direction you were hoping to move.
Definitely had learnt a lot of lessons at the BBC about how you create the conditions for people to thrive in a digital environment. I mean, frankly, they weren't that hard to find if you'd worked in digital. I mean, I'm old. I've worked in digital since sort of the mid-90s, so I'd made a lot of mistakes in the 90s and early 2000s. So, as had many of the, several of the people who joined at the same time as me, we had a lot of scar tissue about how not to do it, and we had some fairly strong ideas about how to create conditions for brilliant people to thrive. One of the things I was worried about when I joined was we sort of inherited about 5 different, much smaller units that had different names, broadly digital technology, digital engagement units. And we merged them and then we expanded them. But a lot of people were existing civil servants and had been civil servants for a very long time who joined GDS. And how many of those would be able to adapt to a radically different culture, albeit initially in the same building? That was a real unknown for me, and hugely pleasantly surprised how many of them made the journey. Some of them incredibly quickly, some of them took a little bit longer, but nearly a good 70% of those initial cohort absolutely adapted to the new GDS culture as if they were born to it. And some didn't, some left, a few left, some took a bit longer. But I think that was a really nice surprise how many people were able to thrive, whereas previously I think they'd felt slightly repressed by the culture. And albeit they'd adapted to it, it wasn't natural to them. And I think one of the opportunities here is to create working conditions that people are able to be themselves and able to communicate as themselves rather than turning into sort of civil servant public service mode and using weird language and writing weird documents and communicating in the third person and all that nonsense, frankly.
Oh, I get it. I've been part of the Exchange Lab for 5 years. To be able to really actualize and be yourself in work and work with people who are in that same place, that's pretty exciting once people get it.
Totally. Being able to speak human. It's always
Yeah.
nice. And I think there's energy and momentum breeds energy and momentum. There's a positive feedback loop you can create about excitement and energy and around a shared purpose and just that sense of buzz. I mean, when you walked into GDS fairly quickly, people who had never been there before, civil servants in particular, would often stop and just be a bit stunned. And it was the hubbub, the energy. It is the hubbub, the energy, and the general sort of excitement level in the room about the mission and the purpose. You can't keep that forever in an organization, but we were definitely able to generate that. Just like most startups, actually, if you know what you're doing, you can create that energy and buzz. And you don't need to hire startup people. It's about mission, purpose, clarity, empowerment, trust, putting the users at the heart of it, being humble about knowing what the answer is. These are not weird concepts. They're just weird to governments. They're just new to government. They're not new to the world. So
Totally.
bringing them to government,
Yeah, and your title doesn't dictate your knowledge. Everyone has great knowledge in the room.
I mean, we definitely ran that too hard, keeping it flat. We kept it too flat for too long, which is a common pattern. But I'd rather keep it too flat for too long than artificially introduce hierarchy when it's utterly unnecessary, particularly when you're trying to encourage multidisciplinary team-based working where people don't have the same line manager. You're deliberately putting them in a team with people with different line management routes up. The hierarchy can really get in the way there. But you also have to recognize as you scale, people need to know who do they go to when they've got an issue at home or when they need to book a holiday. And yeah, just like any new organization, you can stay flat for too long. So minimum viable hierarchy was what we aim for.
Thank you. So you've already alluded to it a bit, but if you have a little bit more, what was it really like and what have you learned?
I think what was it like at GDS? Incredibly exciting, privileged to be surrounded by some amazing people, clearly doing amazing work. Slightly terrifying that you'd empowered them so much they didn't really know what they were doing sometimes, but you kind of had no choice. If you're going to trust, you got to go all in. So going all in. Watching for burnout, I think that was something I spent a lot of my time just checking in on people, weren't just pushing it too hard because being purpose-driven, people, and particularly with that energy and excitement, people can overdo it. When you go into the building, vividly a different space in terms of using any vertical surface as an information radiator, trying things out, doing some planning. Every vertical surface was covered with index cards, post-its, diagrams, video screens displaying, what are people searching for on the site right now. It just felt like a very energetic place to be. There's a sense of energy there that is very often lacking in public service, but not in public servants. I think it's latent in public servants. And I think people are so purpose driven and you just got to set them free to be purpose driven and aligned and have the freedom to collaborate and be empowered. And these are easy words to say and quite hard to do. Much easier to do when you deliberately go out to build a new institution. I think there's a real lesson that it's much easier to create a new institution, albeit maybe inheriting a bunch of previous institutions and with a new name, we deliberately went to a new building. There's an opportunity there to change a culture that's easier than maybe when you've got an existing department or subunit and you're in the same building and the same people are there. We were also able to bring in some new people from outside government, and albeit not as many as maybe many people thought. I mean, a few of them, it's like 40% of people in GDS came from outside government. Vast majority of people came from inside government. But yeah, there's a privilege in setting up something new. And we were very intentional in starting a new institution and use the institution word a lot. Public sector innovation is often about institution making, actually. It really is about what's the new institution we can create here, what's needed now.
Yeah, I really like the way you explain that. I've been in government now for 7 years. I like sharing with my friends and family who are outside. It's like, I can't get over how many brilliant people are here, and who
Totally.
care so much. I've never been around so much heart, mission driven.
Totally. And there's a flip side to that, which is when that mission is pointed in the wrong direction, when that energy is pointed in the wrong direction, wow, you can have some fantastic frictional, pointless fights that have no meaning to them at all, with enormous energy attached, passive aggressive or aggressive. So, it's about pointing that energy and that purpose in the right direction, and people recognizing. I think there's a real thing we worked really hard at around respect for different disciplines, and a peer respects designers, respecting policy people, respecting legal people, respecting operational people, respecting technologists. An absolute rejection of any kind of quasi caste system in terms of power dynamics, which I'd seen that a lot in the BBC. If you were a program maker, you were at the top of the shop. If you were a cameraman, you were down the bottom, and if you were in the IT department, oh, good luck. That sort of anthropological view of an organization and its power structures, that's really quite interesting in most civil servants, where the power really lies and who has the power. And again, being intentional about challenging those power norms is a powerful thing. If you can even just naming them, saying you're saying that because you're a policy person, you think you're more powerful than that designer over there. You're not really. You're all peers. And more of that is needed, more calling out power dynamics.
So did you just have meetings on that, or did you just have training on that? Or
No,
just...
it's about, I mean, as a leader, it's about spotting it happening and dealing with it in the moment and in the conversation. And a lot of it is about naming things and repeatedly naming things you want and repeatedly naming things you don't want. So we would say very frequently, we don't do caste systems here. Now, I'm not sure I'd use that language now. I'm not sure it's quite the right metaphor, but this was 2011 and it worked quite well. We kind of reject the existing default informal hierarchy of power within the civil service based on whether you're policy, operations, technology. We reject that. And it doesn't take long for people to start using that language themselves and challenging those norms themselves. You don't need a big meeting. You just need to use it at the right moment in the right way with a kind heart, and it gets copied. I mean, the amount of things that leading as if you want to be copied is a really interesting concept that I love, which is exactly what it says. You're thinking, what words can I use and how can I try and encourage them to be copied? Thinking about choice of words such that they're easy to copy, like let's do the hard work to make this simple, or let's iterate and then iterate again, or what's the user need? These are all kind of memes that you are injecting into organizational culture that change behavior in the long term. I'm a big believer in change the language an organization uses and you'll change what it does and how it does it over the medium and long term.
I really like that. I expect we'll potentially have stickers with these phrases in the next few months or so. We know that digital service transformation is often best supported from top down and bottom up, with those in the middle finding change to be the most challenging. What was the UK experience, and how can we help support the middle to successfully make that transition?
That's a really great question, and a genuinely honest, hard question. The truth is, those in the middle have often got to the middle through an awful lot of effort, climbing a greasy pole that you're then, through this new culture, kind of denying the right to exist. And that's a hard message. You are not more powerful than other people in your environment just because you are grade X or grade Y. You're there to convene and be a servant leader. That's a tough message, and not everyone can accept that message. And I think one of the lessons I learned was don't try and win every argument with that people in the middle. You can't, and don't expect to. What I also learned was that some people in that middle are really open to leading in a very different way and to being servant leaders of their teams and being champions of citizens' needs, putting them above their own department's needs. And if you're leading a digital transformation across a system, and most governments are systems, they're not just organizations, they're systems of organizations, your job is to find heroes and celebrate them. And I did an awful lot of finding people in some fairly dark corners who were behaving in that middle level, behaving in wonderful ways that are unexpected. And we'd spent quite a bit of our time sort of snuffling out stories of quiet heroes in the middle. And we had a big advantage in being able to blog frequently and you do YouTubes and name people without going through an inordinate internal comms process and blah, blah, blah. We had a lot of freedom, and I'm really glad we did, because it allowed us to play the card of we're going to make heroes of people who we think deserve to be heroes. And then you get then you get more people joining and you get a sort of network of the willing. And we invested quite a bit of effort into bringing those heroes together so they get to know each other and get a little bit of peer support from each other. Like, it can be quite lonely being that countercultural mid-level leader in a department on the edge, outside London, or, so finding opportunities for people to safe places for them to share their stories and share their scars, that proved quite helpful. But the truth is, I think if you looked at the UK government right now, that frozen middle, as I call it, still has an inordinate impact. And that's down to who gets promoted and how they get promoted, which is still fundamentally at a system level in the UK government. you get promoted for the wrong reasons, I think. It's not bad people get promoted, but you get promoted for the wrong reasons. And you don't get promoted typically for servant leadership. And I think you should be doubly promoted for servant leadership rather than being seen to make the right decisions in a decisive way and be able to make a minister feel confident in your grit and gravitas. This is what gets you on in the civil service in the UK still too much, rather than how did you make your team successful? How did you create the conditions for your team to thrive? How did you enable your team to collaborate with other teams in ways? And how did you really make sure the voice of the citizen and the needs of the citizen were to the fore? Those kind of things don't get rewarded enough still. And I mean, that's a change of generations, I think, actually. I think it's a change that takes quite a long time.
Yeah, but it's so human, and I could see, and I really like servant leadership. It speaks to the heart. I could see it attracting a lot more people into government who hear about it and can see how they can connect with their passions and their heart as they grow as a team.
Totally. And I think the latent potential of a different kind of leader that currently doesn't thrive, doesn't push themselves forward because they know they won't thrive inside the civil service already. That was a real lesson to me. The potential of people already in the civil service is just unbelievable. Back to your comment earlier about working with incredibly smart people. There's some incredible people who understandably self-limit because they know that their preferred style is not going to get them where they want to get. So they'll put their head down or they'll look sideways and find another way. And I think you need a range of different leadership styles. And I'm not saying that servant leadership is the right leadership style for every situation. But I think when you're dealing with redesigning digital public services, it's, from my perspective, by far the best mode to have a leader in that being humble, understanding that the team won't know what the right answer is. They'll barely really understand the needs of their users. They'll absolutely hope they understand the intent of the minister, but a servant leadership works really well when you've got a team that's dealing with huge ambiguity and huge uncertainty and needs to be humble themselves. Whereas sort of top-down command and control has its place, but I don't think it's right for redesigning public services typically. Maybe there's a few cases, but not typically.
Thank you. What were some of the most impactful things you have seen at GDS Public Digital or elsewhere to help culture change to support digital and public sector? And what have you found works and what doesn't?
Blimey, that's a big question. I could talk for hours, so I'll try and keep it brief. I'll just give you some examples, really. Changing the language, as per earlier, introducing phrases that really symbolize what you're trying to achieve so that they enter people's vernacular conversations day in, day out. And it's kind of using words like a tabloid headline writer would write them so they get repeated. And I learned the most effective words that we produced at GDS were the 10 design principles that we wrote in 2012, I think in January or February 2012, which were very, very, very carefully written to be memorable and repeatable and used in everyday conversation. And they were the essence of propaganda as a positive force for change, cultural change. You can obviously use propaganda for negative reasons, but absolutely unashamedly propagandist as an approach. Change the language the organization uses to describe what it does, and you'll change what it does and how it does it. That for me is, what are you trying to, what are the behaviors you want to encourage, the habits you want to introduce, and how do you then find words to describe them such that people copy those words and use them themselves? Number one in my list of things to do. I think being radically transparent about your communication. I mean, it's much easier in government because you've got Freedom of Information Acts typically, so it's quite hard to be as closed as maybe other private sector organizations tend to be. But really embracing that and saying, we don't have an intranet. Everything is published. Because A, it's owned by the public anyway, on a fundamental sort of freedom of information perspective, but also you're dealing with a system level change, not departmental level change. And no intranet ever reaches all the parts it needs to reach, even when it intends to do so. It won't be accessible in places you want it to be accessible. Whereas if you publish it on the web, everyone can see it. You just have to share the link. So we really pushed hard on blogging, really tiny little geeky things that teams had done so that other teams could copy it, or encourage designers to blog about, I had these icons, they didn't work, I turned them off. That kind of stuff got shared a lot. Or here's how I made this thing that was inaccessible accessible. You might want to copy it. And from that, culture of radical openness, you get a peer respect, you get a peer community, you get comments in the blogs, you get, blah, blah, blah. And from that, you can get genuinely bottom up community of practices emerging from people who are sharing, feeling safe to share what they're learning as they're going along in government. And that openness and confidence and looking sideways is a huge, big cultural change. I learned something at the BBC as final story that I've never seen done since, and I thought was absolutely brilliant, which was when I joined the BBC as a senior leader in 2001. It was around the same time as a new chief exec of the BBC, who was called Director General. And he really wanted to encourage people to challenge processes that had become so complex that you couldn't get anything done. And sometimes you need process to be safe, but in the context of the BBC in 2001, process had gone mad and had started to rule the place. So he gave everyone in the BBC a yellow card, like football referees have. Everyone in the BBC got a yellow card, and on that card, on one side, it said, "Just imagine," as in, just imagine how simple this could be. On the other side, he had a bunch of values and principles. But the real purpose of that card was, if anyone said to you, "Oh, you can't do that because of this process," you could raise that yellow card as a kind of one-time chance to break that process. It was your freedom pass to break process. And it was genius. It didn't destroy all process, good or bad, which can cause chaos, but it allowed the system to free itself up enough and people to joke and challenge and sort of pretend they're going to raise the card. And suddenly process was fair game, and too much process was fair game. And people were looking, just imagine how much simpler this could and should be now. It was real genius. And he was able to get away with it because he'd previously been the chairman of the Football Association. So people knew he was a football guy, soccer, I think they call it in America, but I believe you're not like that in Canada. Yeah, that was the little tricks like that. They can be really, really, really effective. On one level, they're quite sort of cheesy. On another level, I think they can work. So don't be too scared for a little bit of drama, and creativity would be my advice as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you where his position was before. I was like, it must be football. That's so neat. Internationally speaking, what do you see as the pros or cons of collaborating with other governments to fuel digital change?
Well, I think in general terms, there are very few downsides from finding your peers in other governments. And I mean, I actually think Canadian provinces are the best in the world at looking sideways. Other provinces and beyond as well. You're really, really good globally at looking outside. You're not parochial compared to most governments. I think that's to your huge credit. And definitely in terms of what lessons you can learn from other countries, what mistakes they've made. I do think there's a slight caution around every context is different. Every political context, every cultural, every economic, social context is different. And just because a particular service design has worked in one place doesn't necessarily mean it will work in another, lifted and shifted. Like, I remember New Zealand literally took gov.uk design and plonked it in New Zealand as a beta. I think it's quite flattering on one level. On another level, it's like, don't think you've had the conversations you should be having about, what should really be on the homepage in New Zealand. That was part of the process. And those arguments are actually quite important as an alignment and a shared understanding of the journey. Pushback from New Zealand was, it's miles better than what we've got at the moment. Let's start there, which is sort of valid. Where I do get quite excited, and again, I think Canada has been right at the forefront of this, is at the layers below, shared platforms, shared capabilities, things like Notify, where actually everyone needs to send text messages, everyone needs to send emails. Having a really nice system that allows people to do that across, self-service. It has worked in one country and it's probably going to work in others. I think there may well be more of those as they come along, and that the specific needs of a government context, which maybe the market isn't providing. If one government's done it open source, then for heaven's sakes, nick it. And Canadians are brilliant at nicking I'd say nicking in a very positive, the most positive sense possible. You are brilliant at stealing other people's codes and building on it, and keep doing that. It's why on earth wouldn't you?
Yeah, one team.
One team.
Can you please say more about the responsibility that comes with being a digital leader? What does "we got your back" look like in action?
We got your back means recognizing that the role of people at the center in digital transformation, primary responsibility is to make it easier for people out all over government, in some dark corners of government, who are trying really hard to change the default behaviors and norms about how services get delivered and designed. Your job is to make their lives easier and safer and to give them as much safety as you can at a distance. Then they don't work for you, they work for other people. But how can you make it easier and safer for them to take the risk that they're taking to change their organization or their part of an organization? And it is things like saying we have a new manual here about how you do things, and we've published it, and we're going to defend you when you point your department at that manual and say we should work this way. We should start with user needs. It's about producing, those phrases and slogans that they can repeat and say, well, they're saying them over there, and in GDS, surely we should be doing the same. It's even doing some slightly more dark artsy stuff and saying we have an IT spend control process here. If something needs to be stopped, then it can be stopped. And, you can, in a department, you can say, we really ought to run this through the spend control process, safe in the knowledge it will get stopped. And the same with service standard reviews and things like that. You're giving people power at a distance, even though they don't work from you, from your convening power, from your position of centrality. And there's a truth here, which is with great power comes great responsibility, but it does. I mean, there's a very definite mode shift that needs to go on in lots of digital transformation teams in government, from thinking their job is to tell the rest of government how to do it, to their job is to create the conditions that those in the government who know what the right thing to do are able to do it. And that's quite a complicated thing to say, but a fundamental shift in how you behave at the centre. It's servant leadership all over again, and often quite hard for some people in the team to understand that their job is not to tell other people off. Their job is to support other people. And sometimes those people they are getting it wrong. They're not making perfect decisions out there. They're trying their best to make small improvements within the bounds that they're living within. So they can't do a full multidisciplinary team. They can't start with user needs. Maybe they have to use legacy software because. But if their intent is right and they're trying to move in a meter forward in the right direction, you support them, even when they're still maybe doing it wrong in purist terms. There isn't a lot of room for purism in my model of how you do that. So how you do that, we've got your back. Support leadership mode. It's like support anyone who's trying to move in the right direction in any way, shape, or can. Because frankly, you're starting from a low base, and some momentum is better than none.
A word you've said a few times throughout this conversation is ambiguity. We're living in a world of ambiguity in this work, and you might as well take small risks and try them out because you don't know the answer anyways.
Completely, and equally, there's a propensity for people who've experienced digital ways of working and loved it. There's an entirely understandable propensity to make the perfect the enemy of the slightly better, and say, oh no, they're doing it wrong over there. The right way to do it is this way, and it becomes sort of dogmatic. Whereas people trying to move slightly in the right direction within the bounds that they feel comfortable doing, for me, is a win, and you should celebrate it. And you should encourage them to be bolder and provide incentives for them to be bolder, but don't scold them for doing it wrong. And I definitely seen there's this sort of are you a true believer mode of digital transformation that I find really I don't think it's very effective. I think it just creates an us and them, and eventually you'll get called out for being too purist and lose. So there's a pragmatism to momentum and change. It's not to say you don't have principles. I absolutely have firm principles, but I'm pretty pragmatic about as long as people are making progress in the right direction, I'm going to celebrate it.
Thank you for that. My last question really is do you have any final thoughts?
Final thoughts is we work with governments and private sector organizations all over the world. And my favorite clients are Canadian provinces. Now, I would say that, wouldn't I? But they really are. I think you're amazing at what you do. And there's something around being a sweet spot of scale, that you're not national. And that gives you a sort of malleability and flexibility that maybe you don't perceive, but compared to many national governments, I think you have more freedom. My final thought with all Canadians is just to encourage you to be a bit more rebellious and get into trouble more, because you never really get into trouble in Canada. Not really in this. And there's definitely had to encourage more Canadians than many other governments to take necessary risks to push for change, and that you can't always get consensus before you need to make a first move. And Canadians are so wonderfully consensus building that sometimes it freezes you from taking the risks that are needed to move forward. And I have sympathy for that feeling of needing to be consensus based as a culture, but it has its limits. And I think in the provinces in particular, you've got quite a lot of freedom actually to not need full consensus to make some bolder moves. Yeah, so have no poverty of ambition. You've got an amazing opportunity. You've got a wonderful culture. I absolutely love working in Canadian provinces. I really do. People are so open-minded, so kind. You're nice, kind people, and that goes a very long way in my book. And just be a bit naughtier. That would be my plea. A little bit more naughtiness would be helpful. Naughtiness in the public interest would be my final request.
I really like these final comments. This is something we need to hear. I agree as a Canadian.
There's nothing like national stereotypes, so I'm sure you can throw same back at the British. But,
totally.
One final thought is that there's a sweet spot in Canada around you're big enough to have scale, to have proper digital skills inside your organization, but you're small enough to still be close enough to citizens. And making the most of being able to bring those two realities together, you can get close enough to citizens' experiences. You're not operating at a scale of 100 million people or 1 billion people if you're in India. And yet you've got enough scale in nearly all Canadian provinces, and certainly in BC, to have some amazing, wonderful digital skills in the building. I'd make the most of that. I think you're in a really nice sweet spot to do some more. I think you have done some great work already. You did some amazing work in lockdown. Recognize you've got a really, really interesting position to make the most of it.
Thank you, Tom, for taking the time to share your thoughts. And to the listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode with Tom Loosemore, UK Government Digital Services co-founder. You can connect with me at the digital office at docontentdesign@gov.bc.ca or click the link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.